The Liberals just released their fall economic statement on Monday, and the entire federal government appears to be falling apart. That's it, that's the whole intro. That's right, folks, it's time for another Friday update with your old pal, Millennial Moron. I've only got one story for you today, and it's going to be trying to explain to you what happened in Parliament this week and what might be happening next year. This video is going to involve a lot of political nonsense, but try to stay with me here. This all revolves around something called the Fall Economic Statement, which is basically the half-birthday of the budget. The government typically gives an update halfway through the fiscal year, usually in October or November, with revised estimates for the budget and some updates on other relevant items. This year, much like the budget, the Fall Economic Statement arrived late, with the government scheduled to table it on December 15th, the second last sitting day of the year for Parliament. Now, back in November of last year, the government had committed to a fiscal guardrail involving a deficit of about $40 billion. However, as the fall update got closer, there started to be speculation that they had actually had a deficit bigger than $40 billion. The Parliamentary Budget Officer estimated that the deficit for the past year was actually $46.8 billion, so people started asking questions. Specifically, last week the Conservatives repeatedly asked how big the deficit was going to be, and Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland repeatedly said that she was looking forward to tabling the fall economic statement on Monday. Meanwhile, there had been some rumors that Trudeau and Freeland had been at odds lately, particularly over the GST holiday and rebate checks that were announced recently, and he was planning to shuffle her out of the Finance Minister position and replace her with former Bank of Canada Governor Mark Carney. Then, over the weekend on Sunday, Housing Minister Sean Fraser abruptly resigned from Cabinet and announced he wouldn't be running for re-election. Not the craziest development that's ever happened, but the timing was a little weird. Then on Monday morning, just hours before the fall economic statement was to be delivered, Chrystia Freeland abruptly resigned from Cabinet and posted a resignation letter publicly. The letter included specific references to her disagreements with Trudeau's direction, including, and I quote, "costly political gimmicks that we can ill afford and which make Canadians doubt that we recognize the gravity of the moment." Rough. So then Parliament got started for the day. Freeland wasn't there, Trudeau wasn't there, the person who seemed to be running the show for the Liberals was their House Leader Karina Gould, since everyone else important was just gone for the day. They then launched into several hours of debate and questioning about when the fall economic statement was going to be presented and who would be presenting it. While that was happening, Liberal MP Dominic LeBlanc was sworn in as the new Minister of Finance. For those keeping track, that now makes him the Minister of Finance, Public Safety, Democratic Institutions, and Intergovernmental Affairs. But there wasn't really time for him to get ready to give a presentation about it, so what ended up happening was Karina Gould tabled the fall economic statement.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Pursuant to Standing Order 32, I have the honor to table in both official languages the Fall Economic Statement 2024.
And then she handed the binder to a page, grabbed her stuff, and just left. Anyway, what we found out is that the deficit for the past year was roughly $62 billion, which is more than $40 billion by a bunch. Now, a lot of this overrun was attributed to something called contingent liabilities, which in this case is basically money that they think they're going to have to pay out in lawsuits that they're expecting to lose, mainly related to Indigenous claims that are working their way through the courts. When I was reading about this, I had a hunch because contingent liabilities aren't something you definitely have to pay, and you don't know exactly when you have to pay them. So I thought maybe this was some kind of political power play where they were pulling contingent liabilities forward to this year to make the deficit look really big so they could push Trudeau out and put someone else in as leader. So I compared the projections in the fall economic statement to the projections in the last budget, and it turns out my hunch was wrong. Actually, everything is just looking terrible, and the deficits for the next several years are looking bigger than we anticipated just 6 months ago. Now, Trudeau may not have been in the House of Commons, but he was in Parliament. After all this happened, he had a meeting with members of the Liberal caucus and was caught on camera through a window talking to his party. He was anticipated to give comments to the press after this, but instead, Liberal members flooded out to the press scrum, while Trudeau left through a back door and went to a fundraiser instead. That pretty much brings us through all the important stuff. On Tuesday, the House of Commons voted against a routine motion to proceed with the orders of the day, and instead just did routine proceedings and question period. Afterwards, they rose for their winter break because that was the last scheduled sitting day of Parliament for 2024. So basically, that's what went down this week. There's been a lot of other political rhetoric flying around, and rather than speculate on what might or might not happen in the next month or so, I want to address a few specific issues that have been talked a lot about in the last few days. The first thing I want to talk about is how the Liberal government keeps pointing to our net debt to GDP ratio as a positive financial metric. They say we have the lowest debt in the G7 and are projected to be stable going forward. The problem is, this is a total nonsense metric. When they calculate net debt instead of gross debt, they include things like the Canada and Quebec pension plans as government assets, but they ignore the pension liabilities that are owed by those plans. Basically, for the purpose of calculating net debt, they assume they can use your pension money to pay off debt and can just ignore the pension benefits that they owe you. This doesn't mean that they'll do that, it just means that they're using a dishonest metric to compare themselves against the rest of the G7. The other thing to keep in mind is that here in Canada, we put a relatively large amount of our government spending burden, and therefore the government debt burden, on the provinces. So this is really one of those circumstances where trying to compare ourselves directly to other countries just doesn't work. I think it's still fair to be concerned about the deficit, and constantly claiming we have the lowest debt to GDP in the G7 doesn't really make sense. Another thing I want to talk about is the value of the Canadian dollar. The Conservatives have really been hammering on this point and posting lots of really zoomed in charts that show changes of a fraction of a cent and say the dollar is plummeting because of the deficit. First of all, they never zoom out to show you the inconvenient time period where the dollar dropped about 30 cents or so at the end of their term. But in terms of the actual current number, we're down below 70 cents US, which historically speaking is lower than usual, but not the lowest I've ever seen. Basically, we're back in the same territory as the late 90s and early 2000s, if you're old enough to remember that. The thing is, I don't think this has that much to do with the deficit and has a lot more to do with central bank interest rates, specifically the spread between Canada and the US. Earlier this month, the Bank of Canada delivered a 50-point rate cut, while the US Fed only cut by 25 points, which now puts us at 100 basis points or 1 full percentage point lower than them. This means that investors earn less money on Canadian debt, which means the currency is less desirable to hold, so more money flows into US dollars, and therefore our dollar becomes less valuable. On Wednesday, we saw a sudden drop in the Canadian dollar when the US Fed announced they'd only be cutting rates twice next year. This also caused a sharp drop in stock values and a quick rise in the Canada 5-year bond yield. Like I've been saying for the past year or so, the Bank of Canada is being pulled in different directions on monetary policy. They need to keep their rates somewhat aligned with the US in order to keep our currency from plummeting, but at the same time, the US economy can support historically normal interest rates right now, but we can't. In my opinion, the big underlying problem here is that we have way too much household debt, mostly tied to real estate. In 2008, the US had a big deleveraging event, but we decided to double down and give people cheaper mortgages to keep home prices high. As a result, home prices continued to rise and household debt continued to grow much faster than household income, which creates a huge amount of risk for when interest rates inevitably go up. This has led to a situation where we can't possibly have responsible monetary policy. The Liberals have been celebrating every time the Bank of Canada cuts rates. Meanwhile, the Conservatives have been bragging about how interest rates were at record lows while they were in office. The thing is, low central bank rates are generally a sign of a faltering economy and an attempt to boost it with monetary stimulus. It's not exactly a good sign, we just interpret it that way because our household debt is so nauseatingly high. So the way I see it, we're kind of in a hole that's really hard to get out of. We have too much debt to keep rates high without tanking the economy, but we also can't cut too much or our currency will drop more and inflation will rise because we buy so much stuff from the US. So again, we're pulled in different directions, and frankly, I don't think there's an easy solution to it. Finally, I want to talk to you about Jagmeet Singh's pension. This topic, and the suggestion that he's propping up the Liberal government to pass his eligibility date for his MP pension, is something that's gotten a lot more attention lately because the Conservative Party has been talking about it. This is something I told you about back in March when it was still relevant. In that video, I also mentioned that the Liberals were trying to push the election date forward 1 week to dangle pensions in front of the Bloc Québécois because they knew that Singh was already pretty close to his pension eligibility. However, the Bloc doesn't seem to be taking the bait. But the important thing here is, if you're still talking about Singh's pension, you're behind the story at this point. Conservatives have been running a filibuster in Parliament for months, and when it was interrupted, they put in a final non-confidence vote for the session on December 9th, which failed. Now, Parliament has risen for winter break and won't sit again until the 29th of January. According to the Canada Elections Act, the minimum election period is 37 days, so unless the Liberals themselves call a snap election, the earliest date we could have an election is March 7th of next year. Jagmeet Singh becomes eligible for his pension on February 25th, so at this point his pension is already a lock. Basically, whatever happens from now on is pure political maneuvering and not about the pension. So, assuming the Bloc doesn't have a change of heart, the government is on very thin ice once the session restarts in January. This is a point where anything could happen. The opposition might force an election through a non-confidence vote, Trudeau might resign and prorogue Parliament to find a new Liberal leader, or some other wacky third thing might happen. So, it's hard to say exactly what happens next. Freeland might make a move to try to become the new leader of the Liberal Party, which probably won't work out that well either way. Or Parliament might end up being dissolved in the new year, we'll have an election, and Liberals will pick a new leader after. But as of right now, it does appear that we're nearing the end of Canada's longest running minority government. Anyway, I'm going to be gone for a couple of weeks for the holidays, but I did really press to get this video done for you before I head out. As always, thanks for watching, and also, have a happy new year, have a good holiday season, whatever that means for you, and thanks to everyone who supported me on Patreon, who I don't mention as much as I should. Your contributions have paid for all the equipment and expenses involved in making these videos, and there's even some more left over to improve things next year. So really, thank you for helping me continue on with this hobby and helping me talk to Canadians about issues that I think are important. So once again, all the best, and I'll see you in the new year.